The Consuming Shadow, originally released in July of 2015 through Yahtzee Croshaw of Zero Punctuation fame, before subsequently being re-released as The Consuming Shadow Insanity Edition in November of the same year. It's a game that, especially if you've only seen the odd screenshot or trailer, will probably very much surprise you. I said it before in my first review of the channel, and I'll say it again. I've been a fan of Croshaw's work for a long time now, so it was really only a matter of time before I came crawling back to cover something else. And honestly, I actually felt a little spoiled for choice at first. The early Chizo Mythos adventure titles make for easygoing horror entertainment, but I'd probably want to cover the entire series in one long video, and after Don Rosalok, I'm not doing that yet. On the other hand, again as I've said before, the life of Eric Zahn is interesting, but I wouldn't say I necessarily feel all that invested in it, something I'd really need to remedy before I talk about the game, and Starstruck Vagabond isn't even fully released yet, so that's out the window for now. Nope, it's time to finally talk about what I'd argue is Croshaw's best game to date, especially from a mechanics and gameplay point of view. And I'm really only saying that because there's this gigantic fucking elephant in the room that any player of The Consuming Shadow will be aware of. A huge obnoxious niggle of a detractor that everyone and their dog latches onto when reviewing this game. And you know what, we're gonna rip the plaster off real quick before moving on to what I will argue to the moon and back is what's actually important within this game. So let's just get it out of the way. In spite of all the positive attention I'm now about to offer it, The Consuming Shadow kind of looks like shit.
Silence, Wedge!
Yeah, I know. The art style of this game is essentially a screenshot of your average side-scrolling horror shooter flash game, so much so in fact that it's extremely inspired by none other than the Newgrounds classic D-Animator. But in spite of how amateurish it looks, I honestly couldn't care less. And if you're willing to look past this particular factor, neither should you. Yes, quite clearly, The Consuming Shadow is not a game that demands much attention from you visually. If anything, the more attention you pay to it, the more awkward and unpolished so much of the visuals become. And although there is of course some merit to the auteur or solo game developer that deserves recognition, you really can't help but wonder why Croshaw refrained from enlisting the services of a visual artist here. Looking back on some of Croshaw's previous and subsequent work, it's clear that a fairly lacking artistic flair for visual design has always been something of an Achilles heel for him. And now don't get me wrong, it's improved throughout the years, but it's within The Consuming Shadow that most of Croshaw's audience really took notice. And yet, again, I have to say that you really shouldn't focus on it all that much, because the game's artistic simplicity is not really what's important here. In fact, again, if anything, simpler visuals can sometimes be a massive positive. Be it a Papers, Please or FTL Faster Than Light, there are certain qualities to a more straightforward artistic direction that just can't be ignored. The most relevant to The Consuming Shadow being the fact that it instead provokes your imagination into doing all of the work. Croshaw could have spent hours painstakingly drawing dead bodies in MS Paint or Photoshop to the best of his ability, and the result would have probably been fairly lackluster. But you know what isn't lackluster? The man's ability to fucking write about it. A body lies at my feet. The poor wretch's limbs have been broken and twisted into hideous angles. It must have been a painful end. The people of this town have been welcoming. Perhaps too much so. There's a hollowness to their attitude that belies a combination of entrancement and evangelism. When pressed, the apparently unaffected people muttered disquieting stories of friends and loved ones returning from meetings with changed personalities. The smiling ones all wear gloves and baggy clothing buttoned up to the neck, as if their flesh must remain hidden. Do you see what I mean? Forget how subpar the visual aesthetics might be. This is an experience that would much rather let your mind do all the work. And that's really not a problem. It's classic horror storytelling from H.P. Lovecraft to Stephen King. Your head is going to conjure up far worse from a short descriptor than anything else Croshaw puts in front of you, and it's abundantly clear that he knows that. Similar to Sunless Sea, much of the writing found throughout the Consuming Shadow facilitates considerably greater imagery than a spooky kooky JPEG ever could, which is an approach to game design that can often fall very flat if not done well, and also is something of a trade-off for the kind of player that prefers a quite literal show-don't-tell approach to the gaming experience. Inevitably, something like this is not going to be for everybody, but for those that can engage with this style of interactive media are probably going to have a pretty good time with this game. And speaking of which, this is only half of the Consuming Shadow equation, the other of which being an approach to gameplay that will both frustrate and puzzle you, in what is mostly all the right ways. Alrighty, before we talk about the gameplay, it's probably a good idea to briefly summarise the actual point of the Consuming Shadow for those completely unfamiliar with the game. In true Lovecraftian fashion, an unnamed protagonist is made aware through supernatural means that an unknown entity plans to invade our realm, and in spite of having next to nothing to go on as to which of the 5 gods it might be, the protagonist answers his undeniable call to save the world. Well, most do anyway. You're probably wondering why there is a kill myself button on this page, and we'll come back to that. So, once our hero protagonist embarks upon his valiant journey, like a mighty homing pigeon wielding a gun, your goal is to visit towns across the UK in the hopes of gathering as much information as possible, be it either clues pertaining to the nature of the invading god, or identifying the banishment ritual runes required to get rid of the evil fucker, or just simply collecting the odd tidbit of surrounding lore and information that will hopefully aid you in your quest down the line. The towns you encounter will either be safe and offer you the chance to purchase supplies, or are instead infected with Lovecraftian madness that results in the need to clear out a dungeon, after which there will be a higher chance of finding the vital clues necessary to achieving your goal, but then again, there just as easily might not be any. In fact, you might not find any significant information for what feels like a long time, during which there's all the chance in the world that you'll pick up status effects such as bleeding wounds or broken limbs, or sanity effects such as disrupting visuals or changing menu prompts. This is where the whole kill yourself thing comes in. Or you might just simply run out of time and fail through inaction. A timer of 60 in-game hours is constantly ticking down in the background of your journey, which also accelerates considerably when fast travelling compared to the real-time seconds of a dungeon crawl. And if it reaches 0, it's game over. The invading god has broken through, and you're out of time. Oh, and did I mention that this game is also a roguelike, and with every playthrough all of the dungeons, clues and information and supply locations are entirely randomised? Yeah, that might have been worth mentioning sooner. Oh, and to make your life even more difficult, once a dungeon's victory criteria has been met, there's a chance you'll be rewarded with the sword of a hunter enemy, such as a big scary face or a big scary chuckle brother, who often cause significant damage or sanity loss if they happen to catch you and are instead best to run away from. Oh, and also, with every playthrough, random encounters will just pop up without any warning that can either be profitable or cost the player health, sanity, or time. Oh, and also... already! So, yeah. There's a lot going on here. And to be honest, your first round is probably going to end badly, which is fine, it's to be expected. It quickly becomes apparent with every consecutive playthrough that the Consuming Shadow is an experience that demands a fair amount of attention from you, but it is attention that will be rewarded. Every playthrough reveals more expedient forms of investigation, which in turn facilitates a far smoother round and a hopefully more assured victory. You may start to understand other channels of information that you hadn't noticed before, such as the fact that the descriptions of the dead bodies can often indicate a relevant god's aspect, be it disease or fear, madness, lust or pain. On the other hand, runes inscribed on the dungeon walls can either imply an adoration or insult towards the god in question, a factor that might then reveal another god's relationship with the owner of the rune. But like I said, it's never guaranteed you'll find anything substantial. It's an ongoing logic puzzle that entirely depends on an RNG system that feels fair but can certainly frustrate you when faced with a bad run. So to ensure that you're maximizing your potential for future clues, the player must also competently tackle the combat system, and this can often be a somewhat treacherous affair. Your ability to engage in hand-to-hand combat preserves ammunition, however you are far more susceptible to injury as a result. Whereas keeping your distance and gunning down monsters will certainly preserve health, but it's only up to the point that you then exhaust your very limited supply of bullets and round a corner to then face this thing.
No.
Jesus fucking Christ, what is that?
Now you can of course boost your survivability rate through purchasable or collectible equipment and supplies, some of which will prevent ongoing negative status effects, but similar to the collection of clues, these are again few and far between. And if you're unlucky in the accumulation of money to pay for what you need, wasting an hour chatting with the local salesman is time better spent elsewhere. And again, it all comes back around to that dominant factor. Time. Everything you do within the Consuming Shadow is on a leash, one that instills a lot of natural tension, which can then result in either reckless or last-ditch behaviour. If you're short on time and have only managed to uncover 3 of the 4 banishment runes required, the game will quite happily welcome a guess. Head over to Stonehenge and take your best shot. If you guess the ritual incorrectly, you'll fail, but if you guess it correctly, it still counts as a victory, and you're not going to be punished for succeeding through raw luck. Hell, this can actually result in some of the most exciting moments of the game. A minor fuck you to the invader while winning with odds firmly against you. And I honestly can't help but wonder how slim a mathematical probability it might be to successfully cast the ritual completely blind. I mean, has anyone actually tried that? By all rights, there's no reason why the game would stop you from giving it a go, and I kind of want to, but then again I also kind of want to have this review done before 2023, so... Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that this game can be reasonably unpredictable, and that's a very good thing. Sure, the dungeons themselves can seem repetitive mechanically, but the pieces are shuffled around enough to keep things from feeling stagnant as the rounds continue. The random encounters with other civilians or monsters are frustrating from a point of view of potentially losing health or sanity, but are equally fascinating from the point of view of how unpredictable they can be. Unless you happen to have the exact right piece of equipment in order to defuse a situation, it's a 50-50 gamble on how well things can go. And you know what? A lot of these encounters are pretty damn indicative of how people might react in a near-apocalyptic situation. A meeting with a disillusioned priest now faced with the prospect that his entire faith structure has crumbled around him is expectedly bitter. Whereas accidentally hitting a drunk while fast traveling might instead be an unexpected example of someone finding desperate peace through intoxication, an escape that the protagonist even somewhat envies. And honestly, these are moments that can be genuinely thought-provoking, taking full advantage of Croshaw's writing chops and offering believable depth to the player's surroundings. It gives the player something to latch onto, something to fight for. You want to save these people because you believe in what they're going through. And I could probably list plenty more of these, but for the sake of not revealing too much, I'd rather leave them hidden. You may have noticed that I refrained from including a spoiler section this time around, and it's really only because aside from additional gameplay mechanics that boost the Consuming Shadow's replayability and a healthy amount of random events, there's not a massive amount that technically can be spoiled. The story is minimal by design. It's all down to a roll of the dice and the little bits and pieces that follow. So instead of me ruining the fun, I'd much rather recommend that you experience it for yourself. The Consuming Shadow is the kind of experience where you can just pick a spot and keep digging. So, strange as it might seem, I actually consider the Consuming Shadow something of a comfort game. It's ridiculously easy to crash into a comfortable chair after a long day and immediately boot this up. And for all its logic puzzles and required attention, the most that the Consuming Shadow can really demand from you is 60 minutes per round. And those 60 minutes fly the fuck by very quickly when suddenly you have a broken leg causing sanity depletion if you run, or a bleeding wound that results in a trickling health bar, and wouldn't you know it, the only safe town, and by extension hospital, is 2 in-game hours away, which means you're probably going to bleed to death. On the other hand, it's genuinely satisfying to reach Stonehenge and successfully banish the greedy bastard from invading our lands. And in all honesty, aside from the lackluster visual design and occasionally amusing choice of game mechanic, I really struggle to criticize this game. So yeah, that's it from me on this one. Needless to say, I like this game a lot, and I'm glad to have finally gotten round to talking about it. I won't lie, I've wanted to review this game for probably the best part of 6 months now, so getting around to it at last feels good. If you enjoyed the video, thank you, and hey, why don't you make sure you fast travel your way over to the Steam page for this game. I'm going now.